Our lack of a regulatory framework puts the United States at risk of losing this industry. And if we lose the industry, we also lose the opportunity to regulate the industry and protect consumers. For example, one U.S.-based company had identified $200 million in stablecoins that were headed for North Korea, and they had the technical capabilities of freezing that money, but there's no regulatory framework, and they didn't want to risk the liability to them, and that kind of thing would not happen if we pass the Clarity Act.
Magazine podcast. My name is Spencer Nichols, and I will be taking the place of Brandon Green, CEO of BTC Inc. today, as we sit down with the one and only Senator Cynthia Lummis of Wyoming. We will be discussing her outlook for the Clarity Act, her projections for a timeline for this bill to be voted on the Senate floor, as well as why she thinks the American Strategic Bitcoin Reserve is now more important than ever in terms of the U.S. national debt, and her outlook for the role this asset will play on the asset side of the U.S. government's balance sheet. Finally, she and I discuss what legacy she hopes to leave for Bitcoin and for her nation as she leaves her office in 2027. So thank you for joining us and enjoy the show. Alrighty, Senator Cynthia Lummis, welcome to the Bitcoin Magazine podcast. We are very glad to have you joining us today. How are you?
I'm well. It's my pleasure to be with you, Spencer.
Of course. Well, I know we are a little bit short on time, as you may need to be going to vote on the Senate floor here shortly. But while we do have you here, I think we've arrived at a really critical juncture in American policy around digital assets, but also a critical juncture in American fiscal health and monetary policy. Recently crossed $39 trillion in U.S. national debt. And I know you yourself have been a champion of a Bitcoin strategic reserve in 2024, referring to it as America's Louisiana Purchase moment. I'm just hoping for our audience, can you put this into context, why you think this is important? And really, I think the scale of the Louisiana Purchase, is incredible. Do you think, Bitcoin represents a similar opportunity and an opportunity to make, large scale change for this nation?
Well, the Congress has spent more than it takes in for decades. And in doing so, we've run up our debt. We've run up our debt so high that it now exceeds 100% of the gross domestic product of our nation. In other words, our debt is higher than everything we produce and its value each year. And very few nations have succeeded for very long when their debt exceeds 100% of GDP. So it's time for us to address it. And we've shown no indication as a Congress that we're going to address it by reducing spending or raising taxes. So we have to look at other means. We have to grow our economy. And one way to grow our economy is through the robust use of digital assets and integrating them into our financial products that are offered to everyday U.S. citizens. So I think it's very important that we integrate digital assets into our national vocabulary and national use. We've also seen that because we issue debt, we issue U.S. treasuries to help fund our debt, we need more buyers for our U.S. treasuries. And one of the things that happened after we passed the Genius Act, the stablecoin bill, is because stablecoins need to be 100% hard asset backed, the backers of stablecoins are buying U.S. treasuries, which helps make for a robust market in U.S. treasuries and therefore helps us sustain the purchasing power that backs up the U.S. debt via U.S. treasuries. So these are various ways that we can use digital assets to have a more robust U.S. economy while still facing a pretty high mountain of debt.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think on the one hand, it's how can we ensure that the treasury market remains healthy and that there are buyers for this debt in a potentially high inflation environment? Long dated bonds, very sensitive to that. On the other hand, we have the Bitcoin market cap at about $1.3 trillion right now. I think in the context of global assets, relatively small, but I know you've spoken about kind of the potential for Bitcoin to be on the asset side of the balance sheet in terms of shoring up that balance sheet. Could you speak a little bit more to, where we are now at 1.3 trillion and, why you think this could be a lever for us to improve our fiscal health?
Well, if we had Bitcoin in a strategic reserve that was a buy and hold strategy, We could take, for example, if we held 5% of the world's Bitcoin and held it for 20 years without selling any of it, we believe we'd be in a position where it could reduce our debt by one third to one half. And if we held even more than 5% of the world's Bitcoin, it could actually erase our debt. So, this is an important asset in a buy and hold strategy. There's two pieces of legislation. I have one in the Senate. Quite frankly, it is the less likely to pass. So I'm very hopeful that the U.S. House of Representatives will pass the bill that is being sponsored by Congressman Nick Begich of Alaska. His bill is less specific than the Bitcoin Act is in the Senate in terms of where the money should come from to invest. It
Hmm.
gives the executive branch more flexibility. And that's pretty consistent with where the President Trump executive order comes down to. So my money's on the U.S. House to pass the Nick Begich bill. And I'm hopeful I'll see it while I'm still here in the U.S. Senate and can give it a chance to pass both bodies.
Understood. And I think an important wrinkle for Representative Begich's bill is that it is framing Bitcoin as, the modern thing to do via the American Reserve Modernization Act. Do you have thoughts on just kind of that framing? And, maybe that's helping kind of make this a bit more of a bipartisan effort, which I think today digital assets have kind of become a little bit polarized across party lines. But I see this as a nice overture and something that's gained Democrat support as well.
Yeah, the the House has been more willing to put a regulatory framework in place on a bipartisan basis to address some of these subjects on a bipartisan basis. And so, because the House is more progressive, I mean that not in a partisan way, but in just a future looking way, it has a greater opportunity in the House. And I applaud the way that Congressman Begich has laid this out and taken a very bipartisan approach to the product that he's laid out for the U.S. House.
Amazing. Well, in speaking of things progressing, I think the Clarity Act is top of mind for a lot of people. I think been very hotly contested in the context of the banking lobby and the yield that could be offered on stablecoins. I know the president's office executive director of digital assets, Patrick Witt, has kind of floated a July 4th date where the Clarity Act may reach the Senate floor for a vote. I think other pundits and analysts have projected perhaps sometime in August. I think our audience would love to hear, what is your take on that? Do you have an outlook on when Clarity may be reaching the floor for a vote, and what might be hurdles in getting us there?
Well, I'm very hopeful that we will be voting on the Clarity Act on the floor of the Senate before the August recess.
Mm,
Congress generally is not in session in August. The Senate will be in session the first week of August and not the remainder of the month. I very much want to see clarity uh, addressed on the Senate floor before that. It takes a little while to combine the Senate Ag Committee product, which addressed the Commodity Futures Trading Commission component of regulation, and the Banking Committee product, which addressed the SEC portion of the Clarity Act. We're also working to get some ethics language addressed, which talks about what conduct uh, elected officials will be forbidden from when it comes to digital assets and what the enforcement action is. We're making progress there, and I think that we need to get that addressed before we can get the bill scheduled on the floor. I don't see that getting done before July 4th, and we've got the National Defense Authorization Act, we've got FISA reauthorization, and several other things on the floor before then. But I'm very hopeful we'll see clarity on the floor, the ethics negotiations completed, and that we can move forward yet in July. So we're just a month away.
gotcha. And in the context of clarity, I think that it may get lost on some people that are less so policy wonks. I know you've continually made a point to say that America must be a leader in digital assets, both in terms of the fiscal situation, but also in terms of how our economy integrates into there. Just in a few words, could you share with us, really why clarity is an important stepping stone for that leadership role for the United States?
Yeah, if America wants to lead in financial services, which it always has, we need to put a regulatory framework that is well understood in place because we don't want the digital asset community to relocate to Singapore, to Switzerland, to other countries that have already passed regulatory frameworks. So, our lack of a regulatory framework puts the United States at risk of losing this industry. And if we lose the industry, we also lose the opportunity to regulate the industry and protect consumers. If you look at, for example, one US based company had identified $200 million in stablecoins that were headed for North Korea, and they had the technical capabilities of freezing that money and stopping it from going to North Korea. But there's no regulatory framework, and they didn't want to risk the liability to them of undertaking this without clear regulatory guidance. And so they let it go. And that kind of thing would not happen if we passed the Clarity Act. We would have better consumer protections and we would have the ability to address illicit finance. And then we also have just the simple rules of the road. So these digital asset firms are not regulated by enforcement actions from the SEC that cost them millions of dollars in lawyers to fight. It would be regulation by having a clear set of rules of the road that they could conduct themselves pursuant to certain banking laws that should apply to them sometimes, but not all the time. And those would be enumerated by the bill as well. So I'm very high on the Clarity Act. I'm very hopeful it'll pass so we can establish and keep the United States as the world center for digital assets.
Yeah, I think previous crypto czar David Sachs has said that kind of there was this lawfare that was taking place, and it really this lack of clarity around how businesses can operate in this space really had a chilling effect on both the industry, but also just investor psychology, policymakers willing to approach this despite its immense strategic importance. And I think looking ahead to a lot of people are looking at clarity potentially as a bellwether for the midterm elections. I think it'll be very interesting to see how this vote shakes out. I know the crypto voting bloc had a fairly large impact in the most recent presidential election. So certainly something to keep an eye on. And as well, looking ahead, I know you have said that you will not be seeking re-election here. I myself personally am very curious to hear if you have any plans following the end of your term, and will you continue to stay in the Bitcoin and digital asset space as you have been doing in your role in Congress?
Well, before I came to the Senate, I had a 3 Bitcoin. I put my Bitcoin in a blind trust, so I couldn't be alleged to being working in conflict. I don't know if I still have those Bitcoin, but I hope I do, and I hope when I'm done in the Senate, I can resume investing in Bitcoin. I'm a buy and hold person. I'm a hodler, and I like having an individual wallet. I like the sovereignty that comes with that kind of an investment. And I do intend to stay involved in some manner. I don't know what that is yet. And quite frankly, I'm just going to set that aside and put my shoulder into the Clarity Act and get it across the finish line. But I'm looking forward when I return to Wyoming in 2027 full time to getting my jeans and my boots on in the morning and getting my hands dirty on the ranch, and then staying involved in some manner in the Bitcoin world.
Excellent. Well, the final question I have for you, Senator Lummis, is just what would you like your legacy to be? How would you like it to be interpreted as you leave office, but even further down the road as we look back on American history? I think Bitcoin has been a transformational technology for individuals, but I also think
Yeah.
for countries, like their story is largely untold at this point. How would you like to be remembered for the work that you've done on the Hill, say 20, 30 years from now?
Yeah. Well, I've only been asked that once before, and I was surprised by the question, but the answer that I came up with still sticks with me, and that is that I like to be known as a spark. One of the sparks for uh, America's involvement with digital assets at a time when that asset class needed a spark. And I think I represent sort of an unusual um, spark for the asset. I'm not young. I'm a rancher. I'm from Wyoming, all of which would not necessarily equate to an advocate in digital assets and Bitcoin specifically. But it just so happened that I was that spark at a certain point in time. And I hope that spark lights a fire going forward and that this asset class will grow and mature and serve our nation and its people well.
Excellent. Well, Senator Lummis, thank you so much for the time. I know you have an action packed day coming up here. Our audience will be waiting with bated breath as we observe how clarity progresses, but also the ARMA bill, which you referred to under Congressman Nick Begich. Do you have any, parting words for our audience? Any message you'd like to leave with them before we wrap it up here?
I just want to make sure that people in the Bitcoin space know that because Bitcoin is fully decentralized, Bitcoin doesn't have an obvious advocate. It has thousands of advocates, but that means that every individual Bitcoin holder and advocate needs to play a role in advocating for it in policy venues, in financial venues, in student education levels. So if you're someone that wants to see Bitcoin succeed, you're not going to get it through some high paid lobbyist in Washington, D.C.
Hmm.
You need to do it yourself. And so when you're called upon through social media or some other venue to help participate in influencing policymakers in this area, please pick up the mantle. Please do it because we need you as individuals who understand Bitcoin and see its ability to be a powerful asset in our economy, to take the opportunity to pick up the phone or text and participate in being an advocate for Bitcoin.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that call to arms for our audience. I know many of whom are already taking that challenge and taking that mantle. But Senator Lummis, thank you so much for your time as well. And we hope to connect with you again soon, perhaps following the Clarity Act being voted on in the Senate. But until then, have a great rest of your day. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Spencer. It was great to be with you.
Likewise.